here we are. This is a first for us. This is actually our first true launch. The book tonight that we're featuring is Creative Care, A Revolutionary Approach to Dementia and Elder Care by Ann Basting. This is the very, very first day that the book's available. So this is another milestone for us. And it really couldn't happen to a better author to be imprinted in the Boswell history than Ann Basting. She is a professor of English at UWM. She's the founder of the nonprofit TimeSlips, and she's a recipient of MacArthur Genius Grand. Oh my gosh, people have been talking about this book for months and how excited they are about it. This is not her first book, but it is the first one from one of the big major publishers for the trade audience. We are also completely thrilled that tonight she's going to be in conversation with the wonderful, talented, and large-brained Mary Louise Schumacher, the cultural critic and journalist, long time at the Journal Sentinel, now working on new projects, and a tremendous book reader of all sorts. I'm so glad that this partnership came together. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Louise, who will tell you more about the event and start the conversation.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited to be here with one of my very favorite artists in the world, and with also virtually my favorite bookstore in the world, which we all should support and love dearly. I just finished this book this afternoon, and congratulations, Anne, on giving birth to a really, truly beautiful book. I loved it. It was wonderful to kind of revisit all of the things that you have done, including some things that you've done here in Milwaukee, and to kind of go through that with you. We're going to have Anne read a little bit in just a second, but one thing I wanted to note that's sort of unclear if you look at the book jacket is how deeply personal this book is. It's really almost kind of an artistic memoir. It's Anne taking us through her kind of living through what she refers to as her beautiful questions. And so it's a book that's suited for a lot of different audiences. And I wonder, Anne, if you would just kind of start by telling us, who did you write this book for?
Well, first of all, my big-brained friend, I'm so thankful that you could be here to share this with me, because you lived a lot of these stories as they were unfolding. And I also just want to say that I'm going to turn on the speaker view, because it's really overwhelming to see so many of you who lived, experienced these stories over these 20 years that they've been taking place. And some of you, if you didn't live the stories, you lived the writing process. And some of you actually did both. And I can't, you're remarkably brave and generous people. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you for that. This book, I've written about my work in inviting creativity from everyone, essentially inviting people into relationship through imagination and creativity for 25 years now. And but I've never been able to really do two things. One, to get it out there as broadly as possible. As I've said before, there's an ocean of need. There's, especially now, I mean, it's overwhelming, the desire we have to connect with each other. It's so pronounced at this moment, that bringing a really accessible, I love academia, but non-academic book in a language that everyone finds accessible was really my goal, to get these tools out there as broadly as possible. And then also, a special thank you to my parents who are on this call tonight, on this gathering, whatever we call it, who my mom started to experience memory loss a couple of years ago. And so as I set about and had the opportunity to really write this book to a general audience, I found myself for the first time with memory loss touching my innermost circle of my family. And so it was both an effort to relay these stories, to bring them to be helpful to as many families as possible, and also to process it personally at the same time, which is why I think it is what you say, kind of a personal memoir at the same time.
So would you like to read a little bit from the book?
Sure. I thought I would open with just how it starts. And I think you can get a feel for that, that sense of the narrative and the storytelling. It's a book about the power of storytelling. So that's a lot of pressure to to try to tell stories well, and to invite the reader along with you. So chapter 1, here we go, in which Ruth teaches me what joy looks like. It was opening day. Spirits were incredibly high. I had walked into Morgantown Care and Rehabilitation in Morgantown, Kentucky that Saturday morning to a chorus of exuberant greetings, not what you'd usually expect at a nursing home. Now it was just about 2 p.m., showtime. After 2 weeks of rehearsal and a year of planning, the elders, local actors, volunteers, and staff were about to perform their version of Peter Pan, one in which Wendy is in hospice care after her final phase of growing up. And the audience, rather than clapping to prove their belief in fairies, would meet the extended hand of an elder to prove that they believed in one another. There would be song and dance. There would be a giant crocodile, pirates, and of course, flying. These residents, several of whom had not been out of their rooms for months, were about to welcome an audience to see them and their nursing home in a completely new light. They were inviting the audience to see beauty and meaning in a place where most people see only overwhelming loss. Ruth had been at every rehearsal. If I had to guess, I would say Ruth was in her late 80s, with a bob of gray hair framing her face. Riding a wheelchair, she was one of the dozen elders dancing in the finale to Frank Sinatra singing "Fly Me to the Moon." As Shirley, a resident who'd been the activity director in this very nursing home for 40 years, offered a blessing on the performance, and the stage manager, who's on this call, called out, "Places." Ruth's care partner wheeled her out onto the home's front patio for the pre-show. The wind carried a chill, but every elder in the dance chorus insisted on going outside to greet the audience and to listen to the live music. I looked around at the faces. Every one of them was wide-eyed and wonder-filled, except Ruth. She was crying. Her eyes were bright, but tears rolled down her cheeks. Her mouth was twisted into a half smile, half grimace. I went to her straight away, kneeling down in front of her and taking her hands. "Ruth," I whispered, "are you okay?" She nodded eagerly. "Are they happy tears?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she said with a laugh. "Happy, happy tears." Happy tears. There's no better phrase to capture a feeling of joy in a time of tremendous challenge, such as when we create and experience poignant beauty in, say, a time of dementia, or a time of profound physical changes, or a time of powerfully missing people who've gone on before you, or who are too far away, or too busy to visit. In my 25 years of bringing the arts to people in late life, almost no one believes me when I first suggest it is possible to feel joy in these moments, or that joy and meaning can coexist in some of the hardest times of our lives, if we're lucky enough to live that long. The power of being invited into creating meaning, of working together to create art that has a lasting legacy, is an elusive thing to describe. But when people feel it, they understand it deeply. I'm fairly confident that in the beginning of their training, the staff at the nursing home in Morgantown did not believe in that power, nor did the elders or their families. But after the show, they sure believed in themselves, in one another, and in the power of the shared creative experience. That's the opening.
You will need tissues for this book. I just want to alert you all to that fact. And I was reminded, honestly, that as I read this book and kind of went back through all of the projects that you have done over time, how often they really moved me, and in a way that I don't know that I can completely apply to other artists. So there's something going on there that I can't completely articulate, and I don't entirely understand, but it's definitely a thing.
Well, I'll say that in the Kentucky Project, in the plays in the nursing homes, my role, because everyone was playing different roles, was the tissue fairy, and I would put tissues in my big funky hat with all these things glued all over it, and I would like throw tissues at people because it is such an embrace of joy and sorrow at the same time, that even when you're laughing, you'll find yourself overwhelmed emotionally.
Do you want to go back and talk a little bit about just the core idea of, because you've been embedding yourself into systems, right? So you started going out to isolated or underconnected, I think is the word you use, elders in Milwaukee through Meals on Wheels. You did a production in a single elder care facility at Luther Manor. What you've just described is a production that happened in kind of a whole system of facilities, and that's been sort of this progression. Do you want to just talk about the idea of where the idea came from and what it means to sort of embed into these systems, why you do that?
Yeah, I think it relates a little bit to sort of the journey of the book and the journey of the work, since they're kind of paralleled, which is that when I first started this, and there's stories about that here, it really was just felt like a miracle to bring this creative invitation to people who were otherwise completely shut down from meaning making and expression. And out of a moment in a locked Alzheimer's unit came a series of stories, even just individual exchanges that just felt miraculous. And so there was the approach for a long time in the work was just to give those tools, those interpersonal skills, to invite stories out of people to as many people as possible, like sort of on an individual basis. And that the whole second section of the book is the elements of that interpersonal work, to be able to get to a place where you can invite that from other. And I think that those skills are actually, when people say things like, what you're doing specifically in long-term care would work in so many other settings. I'm like, yes, it's these elements in that second section that do that. But then there comes a point where you realize that the systems themselves need to take up those elements in order to be able to hold them, to sustain them, and that the transformative power of those techniques could really also transform the systems. And that happened like in 2009 with the Penelope Project, which is the first chapter in the third section, which is about systems change. Which was just an incredible experience with a long-standing collaborative partner, Beth Meyer-Arnold at Luther Manor and Sojourn Theater, and then also my colleagues at UWM and my students at UWM, where we, for 2 years, reimagined the story of Homer's Odyssey and took it apart in creative workshops in every level of care. And it really marked the first time that I knew of nationally that an entire long-term care community collaborated on a single project, because those communities are like little, I mean, as with a lot of different places, little silos, independent living. No, nobody over there ever wants to go into assisted living or the skilled care. So they separate, they have separate budgets, separate programming teams, separate everything, partially out of sort of fears and stigmas around disability and death and dying. And then also the adult day program. But this project sort of mobilized the entire community. And we found all kinds of instances where the system itself, the care organization, was taking up the techniques of improvisation and playing along with us. If you can suspend as an artist as long as possible, and this is what I've decided my one superpower is, I can suspend for a really long time the knowledge of when to make it into something. I can hold that process of creativity and creative meaning making open almost an insane amount of time. It might drive other people and some of my collaborators, it drives crazy, but holding it open so that everyone can come into the process, inviting more and more people into that creative process. And then all of a sudden it'll get to a point you go, boom, there it is. Then you have a giant crocodile coming into the nursing home, and the administrative team wearing costumes for the first time, and the high school brass band coming in to perform and doing a kick line. You get these golden nuggets that you couldn't otherwise get if you didn't hold the process open that long.
And it was such a beautiful project, Penelope. And if for anyone who's listening who is not familiar, Anne's husband, Brad, did make a film about that, which is kind of its own thing, tells a slightly different story, but is really a beautiful, it's sort of not a document, I would say, of the project, but it will certainly give you a sense of the story of the people who did that project, and is really a wonderful way to experience it. And I wonder, Anne, if, when you're talking about that process, and I will just add also that my family, we ended up placing my mother at Luther Manor in part as, in confidence because of what we learned about that place through Anne and through Brad. So that was, I often say, like, of all the art reviews I have ever given to anything in my life, that would probably be at the top of the list, that I turned my mother over to these humans because I trusted them because of what I learned through Anne and through Brad. But the details of that project are so lovely. And I think it would, for people who aren't familiar, like even the weaving, how that is part of the story and what you ended up doing, like kind of at the very last minute, this sort of epic piece, maybe you could just share a little bit about that piece of the project.
Sure, and I did pick out a little tiny section from that chapter to read. I can add that as well. And then I'll also say that Brad's company, 371 Productions, has the Penelope documentary screening for free, I believe, through the end of June. So you can actually just watch the documentary, which is kind of great. Yeah. So that some examples of holding open the creative process and inviting people in the care system, all the collaborative partners, which is everybody from the administrative team to the elders to family members and volunteers and students and artists, all sort of equal ensemble members. When we came to wanting to move the play, we were going to do scene by scene through the Luther Manor community and stage it in different places. And the designer from Sojourn wanted to mark the path in some way, so people wouldn't get lost, because it's like 1 million square feet. It's a huge place, right? And so she came up with the idea that Penelope was a weaver. Kind of famously, she puts off her suitors by weaving her father-in-law's funeral shroud as is her duty as a daughter-in-law. And then she weaves all day, and then all night she tears it out. And she tells the suitors that she'll pick one of them when she finishes it. So she's clearly never going to finish. So some huge weaving would be appropriate. So I remember the meeting day when Shannon sat down with the staff, who'd been pretty used to this, are laying out these huge challenges. And Shannon said, can you guys weave something as long as the path we're going to take through the community? You could see sort of the addition in their heads as they were, figuring out how long is that. And it was almost a mile long. And a couple of the staff members were like, and then one of them, Ellie Rose, said, yes, I have no idea how, but yes, we'll do it. We'll figure it out. And I thought, they just said yes, and they don't know the answer. They just took it up as a challenge. And that was a really great example of like how you could feel the creative process get absorbed into the system. It turns out that they, in order to make the weaving accessible, they've got the plastic rings that go around 6-packs of cans, which turns out after they tried stapling separate ones together, they come in a big unending roll at liquor stores, apparently. They got one donated, and they cut them into sections, and then they gave extra pieces of fabric to the elders who, if they had physical limitations, could just move the fabric through the plastic rings. Or if they didn't, some people were crocheting around the edges of the plastic rings. And I just cleaned my basement. I have a ton of it still in my basement. I should have thought to bring it up to show you, but it was just beautiful. And we almost didn't get enough of it. They had to create take-home kits for the staff, and also for people who have insomnia, they took take-home kits to their rooms at night. Students took it home, and by gum, by the end, we had enough. In fact, we had extra. And it marked just a really beautiful example of expressions of individuality. So each section was unique, but it all formed this whole as it hung through Luther Manor, which was really beautiful. So that is the story of the weaving, but that's not the story I was going to tell, which is really an incredible soul whom we met as part of the Penelope Project, Rusty Tim. He got it right away. He got what we were doing. He understood it. He dedicated himself completely to it. And we put him in the show for his trouble. We said, you're hired, you're in. So he played, 2 people played all 54 suitors. So a young professional actor, Jake, played one, and then Rusty played his counterpart. And they wore t-shirts that had 54, let me see. Yeah, each one played 54. So they had little stencils of 54 people on their t-shirts. And so they played all 108 suitors. And he was just game for anything. He was so enthusiastic and supportive. So I just dedicate this little section to him. As I said, we move scene by scene through Luther Manor. This is the story of getting to the slaying of the suitor scene, where in the dining hall, in the assisted living dining hall, which was quite a feat to stage, I have to say, because we had to strike the set within 5 minutes because the staff was waiting to turn it over for dinner. And so we had to remove everything really fast and leave the room. When the train of audience members arrived at the dining hall, they were welcome to sit along a long glass wall on one side of the room. And on a long bench just behind them sat a dozen elders with memory loss, watching the commotion and doing simple hand gestures in unison. Was this part of the show? Who was watching whom? This was the scene in Finding Penelope in which Odysseus finally sheds his disguise as an old beggar, proving his identity by shooting an arrow through 12 axe handles and then Aided by the goddess Athena, he slays the suitors. Odysseus was played by James Hart, a professional actor with Sojourn Theatre. Athena was played by Caroline Imhoff of the Courtyards assisted living area. She wore a crown of laurels rescued from a corner of Luther Manor's basement storage room by the building maintenance director and spray painted gold by Sojourn's designer, Shannon Scrofano. The suitors were played by just two people, Jake Cohen, a young professional actor in his 20s, and Rusty Tim, a Luther Manor resident who was born for the theater, but took 70-some years to make his professional debut. Both Jake and Rusty wore t-shirts with stencils of 54 men on them. Each would menacingly charge Odysseus, only to meet a Three Stooges-style demise. One loses a thumb war. Another gets a lethal poke in the eye or a crushing of the hat. As the suitors are put to rest over and over again, another actor reads from a long list of 108 things that Luther Manor residents told us that they endure, much as Penelope endured the suitors and not knowing whether her beloved was dead or alive. The elders' list contained both the silly and the sublime, macular degeneration, icy sidewalks, slow elevators, missing my friends, my annoying sister-in-law, stroke, dementia, guilt. Guilt was the last to go, and with its departure, Mira, another main character, was free at last to find and visit with her mother, as was the whole audience. With all the suitors dispatched, Odysseus, with his shiny breastplate and bare muscular arms, led the audience back into the hallways of Luther Manor, singing, "Home, let me come home. Home is wherever I'm with you." Mira, played by Sojourn's Rebecca Martinez, joined him, buoyant and free from the weight of being a bad daughter. Both were eager to find Penelope at last. Odysseus, his beloved wife, the Queen of Ithaca, and Mira, her mother. Together they marched the audience joyfully to Luther Manor's chapel, where an array of seats awaited the audience and where an older woman slept peacefully in a golden wheelchair just in front of the chapel stage, which was hidden by a curtain. Here at last, after Mira and Odysseus had journeyed deep into Luther Manor to find her, was Mira's mother, played by first-time actress Joyce Heinrich. The curtain opened to reveal some 30 elders, some on hospice, some with dementia or stroke, or both, all playing Odysseus's queen. Neither Penelope, not the mythic nor the contemporary, recognized their loved one. "Do you know me?" Mira and Odysseus pleaded in unison. Then both of them understood. This isn't really what matters. What matters is that they know her. Both dig deep through the layers of fear and sorrow of not being known and the guilt of not being able to fix it to prove that they know her. "Penelope, you are my cunning, noble, wise, and lovely mother," says Mira. "Penelope, you are my cunning, noble, wise, and lovely queen," says Odysseus. And with the comfort of feeling truly known, both Penelopes, Mira's mother, and the chorus of elders playing Odysseus's queen extended their arms and welcomed them both home with movements and words that had been created by the elders themselves. "My heart is open to you. My soul and my spirit welcome you to my home. I am calling you. I am hearing you. I am seeing you. Your eyes sparkle like the stars." There you go. I can't even get through that.
I feel like that project was, I don't want to presume, but maybe an important turning point for you. It opened you up in really important ways. I also wonder if you could talk a little bit about the impact that had on Luther Manor. I know Penelope became a verb after that, right? So what, because there's this huge heroic kind of effort that happened over this long period of time, and then you can't do that. You keep doing that, right? So you leave, and what happens when you leave, and what has been the impact on that place?
Well, they've become one of the places that Rusty's energy really drove a lot of the continued creative work there. And Rusty staged, I think, 7 more plays and original pieces that he put together, and then figured they'd be radio pieces because people wouldn't have to memorize; they could just read the scripts, which meant people felt more comfortable. And then my own work with the theater department at UWM and the Peck School of the Arts included a student artist in residence program where we, and some of those student artists I see on this call, we embedded them. They lived in care communities. They still do for a year, getting room and board in exchange for building community through the arts. And Luther Manor embraced that quite quickly. If they had their druthers, they'd have three of them at the same time, one for each area of care. So they've really embraced this approach in an ongoing way. Right away after the performances, they talked about Beyond Penelope, became an ongoing meeting group of how to maintain that level of openness and collaboration. And I think growth and discovery became kind of synonymous with the name itself.
And do you feel like the care staff there has sort of taken in the strategies, and do they continue to use those regularly there as well?
I think I think yes, and I think too that there's a natural life. Very few of the same staff are there, so you have to keep introducing the lived experience of these moments. Now that Rusty has passed, we have to find a new way to really match his energy. They did dedicate the chapel, the kind of media room to him for ongoing performances, which is great. But it takes a constant infusion. I mean, systems and institutions really have they're not set up to embrace risk and hold open the creative process. They're set for continuity and sustainability and sameness, right? That's the definition of it. So you have to kind of constantly find a way to push against those things. And I'll also say that long-term care is, I think it's still the second most regulated industry next to nuclear power. It is really hyper-regulated. And even now, survey people come in and there's a culture of fear that they're going to do something wrong. And so risk is something that is sought to be completely eliminated, not opened purposefully. So we're trying to always create language and I think structures that allow it to come in ways that the system kind of recognizes and allows. And I think one of the reasons for writing this book too is to continue to create language that can push against that institutionalization of humanity.
I feel like there's this other layer that you're, confronting in this book as well. Like throughout the book, it's a narrative about coaxing open doors and people kind of one after the other, whether it's a kind of very on task Meals on Wheels volunteer or some of the elders that you want to work with. And there is this also resistance to not just risk, but play and creativity and improvisation and opening people up to participating in that. Can you talk a little bit about what that's all about?
Yeah, that was really, there's a chapter in here where I actually go back in and into the definitions of both creativity and care, and what literally happens when you smash them up against each other. And that was really eye-opening for me. I'd sort of been operating with an understanding, like I know what these terms mean, but then really going back in was really enlightening. And one of the things in the course of that research was the realization that a lot of theories are play is only associated with children and learning and growth. And there's like this weird feeling when play becomes inappropriate for adults, or sanctioned in certain ways, like Halloween, as that's become like this huge holiday for adults to celebrate. That's been like one of those sanctioned places where it happens, or Mardi Gras, right? Like that is a super sanctioned place for play to happen. But in everyday life, where is play okay? Where can that happen for adults? And I think we have a lot of work to do to kind of make that safe for people. That creativity and the play that's inside of it is life affirming. It's how adults and older adults can learn and grow, just like it does for younger people. So that's a little part of that. I have a little section from that creativity chapter, if you want me to read that. That's actually, let me see, proof of listening. No, that's this one. All right, how do I lead up to this one? I'll say one of the things about, this is when I'm taking apart the concept of care, is that I started realizing that, you know, there's a lot of hangups that we have about, I don't want to be a burden, that we don't want to reveal that we need care, and that what are the models that we have for being an empowering recipient of care? If you switch care relationship to being reciprocal, how does the person who receives the care empower their caregiver, accepting care at the same time, so that you're kind of refusing the passive and active role, but seeing it much more as reciprocal. And this is just a section where I talk about that. The fierce pressure to disguise evidence of aging and the stigma that shrouds dependency keep us isolated and ill-prepared for stepping into caregiving roles. Too many caregivers are laboring alone and unsupported because they don't recognize themselves as caregivers, or because they hide away out of shame or the belief that they're protecting someone's identity or dignity. This shame and silence can also breed depression and bitterness that Eva Feder-Kate describes as haunting her mother. How might we imagine being a good recipient of care? What might be the exchange of gifts between good care partners? How to ensure both feel dignity, support, and growth? While the model of reciprocal care has emerged in the last several years, there's been little conversation about what it might mean to be a good recipient of care and how we might learn or pass along such models. The day after my father burst forth with his discomfort about the possibility of having to provide physical care for my mom, one that I fully understood, we three were gathered in the tiny living room of their Northwoods cabin. I was sitting behind them at the dining room table out of view when I observed my mother quietly reach out for my father's hands, and he took them. "Have I told you how grateful I am for you?" she asked him softly. "Yes," he said, his eyes welling. "You have." For a brief few years after college, and before she started to have children, my mother was a social studies teacher. Now she is teaching both me and my father, even in her time of accumulating losses. She is giving us the incredible gift of modeling how to receive care. Creative care, what happens when these two words come together, dragging with them decades of preconceived ideas and assumptions? The tension between the words calls attention to the generative nature of one and the depleting qualities of the other. By its very definition, creativity is new and valued. Care seems the opposite, defined by loss, devalued at every turn, pulling down economic productivity and inhibiting generativity. Creativity is the place we want to be. Care is the place we're forced to go, sometimes kicking and screaming. Yet when we bring them together, the tension between them vibrates with possibility. That tension can help us envision and shape a world in which care partners invite each other into meaning making, together adding something new and valuable to the world. A world where growth is possible even in the deepest loss, and all the way to the end of life. Bringing the words together helps us imagine and shape a world where care is reciprocal healing, where loss is no longer a black hole that consumes everything around it, but instead can invite us to become our best selves. A world where creativity is assumed to emerge in relationship with caregiving and is the better for doing so. Bringing these two concepts together makes me question how each has functioned separately for so long, at least since the formalization of medicine and medical training in the 19th century. Where has creativity been practiced? By whom? Where has care been practiced? By whom? Might places of creativity and culture making also become places of healing? How might places of healing open themselves to culture and meaning making? Real meaning that resonates with and emerges from both care partners, not meaning that is prescribed by one for the benefit of the other. When I was a kid, maybe 10 years old, I would play outside for as long as I could. I remember there was a row of bushes down the hill along the side of our house. One of my favorite games was to burst through two of those bushes and into the open field next door. Each time I did it, I imagined a different location in the world with a different sick animal that needed my help. Boom, I was on the savannah in Africa tending to a sick giraffe. Boom, Alaska, rushing to the aid of a wounded otter. Boom, the North Woods of Wisconsin, where a porcupine badly needed my attention. When I came inside from playing, my mom, I imagine her at the sink, fixing dinner, would simply ask me, "Which animals did you help today?" My mother, who loved and loves gardening, hiking, painting, and writing. What questions will I ask her? What questions will draw on who she is and invite her creativity? There you go.
Oh, beautiful. And I just want to say, I don't know where your family is in this like giant grid of faces, but I just want to say hello to them. I've heard about them for a long time, and it's nice to sort of be with you in real time. And I think I love you even more now that I've read this book. And I wonder, Anne, if you could just talk a little bit more about, you know, can you imagine, you know, envisioning the days ahead for you and your family? Can you imagine having that kind of reciprocal relationship with your mother? And could you, you know, when you think about all of the people and all of these projects and productions, could you imagine your family or your mother in one of those sorts of projects in the future? Like, is that a place you could see her?
I think, you know, in some ways, maybe I keep writing these pieces to fit myself into where I can imagine myself. The culminating choral finale of Penelope, there was a family on stage, all in the chorus, and they told us that they never had, the wife was living in independent living, the husband had had a stroke and was in skilled care, and the daughter came to be with them, and they all three performed in the chorus. And there was no opportunity for them to do that all together. creating something together that was accessible to him, because it was all call and response. So he didn't have to memorize anything. He could do it, the gestures as he had the capacity, and he could speak as he had the capacity. And so they could do it from a place of strength, and in a context of beauty and value. And that is just something I think should be available to everyone. In the grand finale of one of the final chapters is about the Kentucky Project, where the final piece was actually the elders were leading the singing of "I'll Fly Away," which is about dying. It is a jubilant expression of joy with folk musicians, and in the final production, we actually had the high school brass band playing along with us as well. Piano, fiddle, I can't remember all the instruments that were there. And the whole place was singing, staff, family, audience, elders, everyone together. And I think inviting people into the joy of what can be a person's remaining time is just something I hope I can not only create for my own family, but also for other people's families. I think that's what I'm trying to do, create those opportunities.
One of my sort of favorite ideas in your book, which is sort of, I think, core to your practice, is this idea of the beautiful question. And like I said early on, I sort of feel like this book is you living out to your own creative way, your beautiful questions, one at a time. And I think mentioned in the book, you say, beautiful questions make for a beautiful mind, even in unbeautiful moments. And I wonder if you would, first of all, just tell us what a beautiful question is. And I would like to know, what are the beautiful questions that sort of remain for you? What are the unresolved, open, for you as a person and in your work, what are your remaining, still processing beautiful questions?
That is the best question. Thank you. A beautiful question came, the notion of the beautiful question. We used to just say for the TimeSlips methodology that we ask open-ended questions that aren't yes or no. Open-ended is kind of a boring way to describe it, because there's an art to asking those questions and an art to suspending your own desire to lead someone with a question. So an example that I will give often is like a common visual prompt we have is people just love this picture of penguins that we have on the TimeSlips website, and somebody might say, are they going to a costume party? And that is an example of a question that's yes or no. Right? So it's no fun to answer that, because it's much more about the question asker's creativity. And the person answering really doesn't get a lot of freedom. But if you just say, where are they going? That's all, the person answering that question has so much creative leeway, right? All the creative power. And so the art of learning to ask those questions is about the art of retreat for the facilitator. And it's an art to retreat, right? You have to learn how to do it in order to let that person's creativity flower. And then with the Islands of Milwaukee project, we came to this, we were trying to bring creative engagement to people living alone or underconnected. And we found this challenge in that our collaborating partners with Meals on Wheels and what was then called Interfaith, who had home visits and telephone visits, were describing the project as arts and crafts. We're going to do arts and crafts. And everyone said no. don't want to do that. I'm like, I'd say no too. So we needed a way to describe a really simple way that didn't intimidate people or feel too vulnerable or risky. And so we came to the Sojourn partners, and Maureen Towie was my co-lead artist on that project. We came to this expression of, I have a beautiful question, or I have a question of the day. Would you like to hear it? And everyone says yes to that. Don't you want to hear the question of the day? So we ended up phrasing like 45 of these questions. And that's where I really came around to this idea of those questions take such art to shape. They're kind of poetic, and they invite you to kind of see your surroundings in a different way. And both the asker, they have no right or wrong answer, and both the person who asks the question and the person who answers can answer as a point of sharing, and it's a shared sense of discovery. So that's how I define that. And that you're probably like, what the heck would an example be? But for the Islands of Milwaukee project, it was questions like, what is your safe harbor? What do you treasure in your home and why? What is a beautiful sound in your home? So it's tapping the senses, and it's inviting you to recontextualize your surroundings, which I tell you that project could not have been more prescient for this moment. And we have rekindled that project, and on the TimeSlips site have a beautiful question creativity guide that people can use to embed into telephone reassurance calls. We've just sent out several 100,000 postcards with those beautiful questions to be used in individual rooms for people who are kind of locked down, as well as with meal delivery again too. So the second part of your question, which is, if I remember, what beautiful questions still remain for me, I would say, can we end loneliness? How can we end loneliness? If I want to get to a non-yes or no question, I've really come to see that as the unifying component of the work. And again, it couldn't be more prescient for this moment. How can you connect with someone that otherwise feels lost to you? And then for myself, can I live my own advice? How do I live my own advice? And how do I grow it so it's sustainable and also gets to systems change? And then in the other direction, how do I absorb it into my daily moments in my own life?
I feel like we should get to some like questions, but I do want to ask one more question about, I have like all these questions we're not going to get to, but I do want to ask you a little bit about COVID-19. And as you say, this is a really heightened moment for especially people who are in elder care facilities. We are all also kind of experiencing, a communal isolation of a sort that, as I was reading your book, the language about what people experience in elder care facilities, there are some resemblances to what we're all experiencing right now. And I just wonder, is this a moment of heightened attention? Is this a moment for us to experience some empathy? Could this moment mean for that field, I guess?
I think it's been waves. The first wave, I thought, oh my gosh, the words nursing home and vulnerable elders have never been uttered more than in the last 2 weeks. Everyone was like, oh my goodness, we need to pay attention to this. They're very vulnerable. We need to throw all of our focus here. And then came the wave of remarkable ageism, of they've lived long enough. All resources are going to hospitals and not to long-term care. I'm on some Facebook groups where I'm watching leaders in culture change and long-term care beg for PPE and go into these dark trading zones where they try to buy, acquire PPE and it never gets delivered, and the prices are jacked up, and it became this place where all the stigmas of before just became exacerbated. And that's really scary, and that's a layer that's still happening. But then I think I'm very hopeful in that I don't think we're getting enough stories about generosity and enough stories about the creativity that is pouring out of care systems. And wherever you see a barrier popping up, like families are not allowed to visit, people are finding ways to make it happen. And that to me is really, really inspiring. I also think that there's some cracks in the system where we're being made to see how the price of our denial, the price of not visiting and being engaged in your long-term care community, in your area, is that we've allowed warehousing to happen. And we seem just fine with that. Even though they're highly regulated, the structure of the buildings, the rate at which we pay frontline caregivers is an embarrassment. They don't earn a living wage. The way we structure care, we don't partner one caregiver with a person with dementia so that they can develop a relationship. They rotate around the whole floor. Only in very exceptional places are those practices not done, and people are really trying to find a way to do it differently. So I think another hope is that we're talking about it, and we're seeing the flaws. We're seeing the price of not accepting help, that people don't know. People are living alone and experiencing kind of a second contagion, which is loneliness, and people are literally dying of despair and loneliness. Human beings can't take it. We can't take isolation. I quote in the Proof of Listening chapter an article by Atul Gawande about solitary confinement and the psychological impact of it. When he describes it, it sounds a lot like dementia. We can't handle isolation as a species. So I think it's a moment where we can really question how we organize our generational divisions, how we value caregivers or devalue them. It's a real opportunity for that. For me, what I am hoping, and where I'm putting a lot of kind of long-term investment for sustainable change, is the final collapsing of the separation of arts and culture and health and social services, which for some reason have stayed these pillars, separate pillars, for 100 years. And you can start to see some of the erosion of those two things coming together. But things like social prescribing, where the healthcare field is aware of all of the incredible riches in the arts and culture field that could be supporting people who are isolated or need engagement, that's where I think some really exciting things are starting to happen.
I feel like I could ask a lot more questions, but we should let some folks in and to ask their questions. So Chris, do you want to?
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your more recent ventures as well, where you're starting to facilitate creativity on the part of institutions themselves, and facilitating them to find new modes and new methods. It's been another turn for you post Penelope, I think, and I've only heard about it briefly, and I'm curious if you address that at all in your book too.
A little bit, thank you, Nathaniel. A little bit in that some of that work has come even after writing this. So the next big project I'm working on is a collaboration, well, really one that just sort of burst forth with COVID, and another that I've been working on that we started before COVID with Dementia Inclusive Durham, which is a whole citywide initiative to make a dementia inclusive community. So the people who are trying to live at home during this experience, which they should be able to, can feel supported by their community and understood by their community. And so it's a cross-sector partnership with arts and culture, education, health and human services, faith-based groups. It's a really incredible network that came to us to create a project that they could all be the conduit for through, so sort of like Islands of Milwaukee, but even bigger. EMTs having a way to engage, faith-based groups who often have a lot of older congregants that they're not quite clear how to engage and be supportive for. And then what we did was come up with the Beautiful Question Project, that they can use all their mechanisms, all their touch points to identify people living alone with dementia, which is a really vulnerable population. And the idea is that, again, a phone number or a card that comes back, and that collaborating with Duke and hopefully North Carolina Central, which is also in Durham, to have the students become part of that network, figuring out systems to bring the creative engagement out to folks, bring their responses back, build on it with artists, and then use that to create a community-wide celebration where people can, in our definition of meaningfulness, feel connected to something outside of themselves, know that they're part of something bigger, which is also connected to the concepts of awe that I talk about in the book as well. And the really exciting thing, we applied for an NEA grant. We'll see, we did it before COVID, so who knows, is using all the answers to the beautiful questions. I'll write them up I'll sculpt them kind of into a collage poem, and then hire a composer and arranger to work with the Durham Children's Choir to create an original piece for the children to sing, and that's interactive, that also prompts choral responses from the audience who's gathered. So again, what we now do is model that would technically usually be in the second year of a 3-year project, and then the third year we just coach that team as they design their next project. So one of the things we've done is all of our projects are about 3 years now. So in the first year we train, in the second year we create a model communal celebration, and in the third year we coach whoever the trainees are through the creation of their own next project, so that it becomes sustainable. And then we also leave documents and visuals and things like that to become part of the institutional memory, so that they can refer to that as well. So those are just some of the techniques we've learned from Penelope, where we actually had kind of a painful exit because we didn't build that third phase quite long enough. And I was lucky that was in Milwaukee, so I could stay connected. But it would have been really kind of traumatic if we wouldn't have been able to do that.
And
hi, Carol.
can you
Yeah,
remember me?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I'm still with Arts for the Aging, and we're now meeting to figure out how to keep our work going. And I am sort of at a point where I have no idea how I can do what I do in the group online. I wondered if you had any suggestions how we could keep this going.
Yes. And in fact, just today, the TimeSlips team we were all set to do our Creative Care Institute, which is usually a 3-day gathering where people learn techniques and the community building process. We're like, we have to do it virtually and do it all focused on this adaptation to remote engagement. And I really believe that for for equity's sake, that we shouldn't rely on this beautiful tool that we're all using right now. I think we need to rely on telephones and visual description and the mail. God bless the post office. I will say it and I will say it again. God bless the post office. We need it. We really need it. And so much visual art that you do, Carol, could go through the mail. I remember also seeing a project from Creative Aging North Carolina, which was sort of, it's a terrible name, but exquisite corpse type exercise, where it's like a continuing piece of art that goes through the mail. It can be developed from person to person and continued and go back and forth from people who are participating. So any way that you can get materials to each other, the challenge right now is actually also infection control. So you have to build that into any kind of mail project that you do or creativity kit project that you do, which is really just, I think, embargoing or sequestering the material for 24 hours and you should be okay. Depending on what the materials are. But look for that Creative Care Institute. It's going to be pay what you can, free access for those who need it. I think we decided sometime in July, it was just today's meeting when we decided that. And we're going to offer sessions on how to do this through the mail, how to do it through the phone. Sammy Goodrich, who's actually on this call, has developed for TimeSlips the telestories model, where we just do it through the phone. And there's a lot people can use through music and sound through the phone as well. Sammy is majored in musical theater and has a skill of being able to invite sound and music and create music and poetry and stories through telestories. So there's lots of ways, and we'll be brainstorming with all the people who attend, which is what we always do, create giant ensembles to think bigger and better through the process of that institute.
Just knowing the work that you're doing, and you talked a little bit about the stigma of being the recipient of care. And if you're looking at your next, your older generation and your family, and thinking about just seeing a need in the present or the future, how can you broach those conversations in a way that's sensitive and is not kind of taking something away from your family member? Just letting them have their dignity and still creating a space to be receptive, for them to be receptive and for you to be receptive, and have sometimes challenging conversations about the future and about what they might need in the future.
How to have conversations that are open and honest and that invite someone into vulnerability from both sides, I think, is how I'm hearing that. I think it's just really hard. And I think it's a lived practice, almost like a meditative practice of just being present and thanking a person every time they allow you in any way, and naming it. Thank you for letting me be here. Thank you for letting me see that. Thank you for letting me help. It's really meaningful to me to help you. And I'm so thankful for that. Because I think people only assume that they're hurting you or bothering you or embarrassing you. I think too, I match that personal work with culture work, which is trying to get to do a lot of education around ageism and to help people kind of unearth their own feelings about vulnerability and aging and how they're even imagining it for themselves, in order to then get to a place where they can imagine what it feels like to the people that they're potentially caring with and for. So I think it's a dual approach of examining your own feelings and kind of processing them, and then just taking the time. That's the other gift of this moment, is that we have time right now. It's really kind of unheard of, and to take it and write letters and connect and be present with people as much as you can. It's really hard because you can't do it physically, but you can find other ways to do it. I hope that answered it in some way. I don't know. It's a hard question to answer.
So we're so thrilled that we could be part of this launch. We expect to see a lot more about the book as the reviews come out. Congratulations to Anne, and thank you so much. And thank you so much to Mary Louise, and thanks to all of you, because we wouldn't have a virtual bookstore without you. And hope to see you at another event and someday in the bookstore. So thank you all.
Thank you everybody for being here. This is really special.